Hi everyone, welcome to this fifth and last webinar of our MEB webinar series. We'll wait a short moment for more participants to join and we'll be starting very shortly. Hi everyone, so thank you very much for joining us today for this, as I was saying, fifth and last webinar of that MEB webinar series jointly organized by CALP and the World Food Programme. A quick word of introduction just to thank all of you who've attended previous webinars and for the very high interest we got throughout the series. We also apologize because, as you may have noticed, we have not yet shared the Q&A document from last week on converting the MEB into transfer value. For those of you who've attended that webinar, you could see that we received many questions and quite tricky questions, actually. So we are working on it and we'll be happy to share that document along with the one for today. So you'll receive two Q&A documents next week. As for those who have not been able to join the previous webinars, you can find all the recordings on CALP website. I would kindly ask my colleague to maybe put the link in the chat box. So we are convening today to talk about what could be the final step when we talk about MEB process, which comes to MEB review and updates, and we'll be trying to identify together what are the trigger points for MEB revision and update. As usual, I am with my colleague Nuna from WFP HQ, who will be setting the scene with some technical background on this discussion. And we are very happy to be joined today by Alexandre Gachou. Alex, if you can, yes, thank you, so we can see you. Alex is working with the ICRC in Geneva. He's cash and market specialist, and he will be sharing experience from Lebanon. And we are also very pleased to be joined today by Guy Obama, who is based in Yaoundé with FAO. He's the Regional Food Security Advisor in charge of the monitoring of the COVID impact in West Africa. And he will be sharing the experience of updating the MEB in the COVID crisis in Mali. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nuna for the technical introduction. Thank you very much all.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this fifth emission of our series. Just as in previous webinars, I am taking the chance here to introduce a little bit and remind us all like what we're talking about when we talk about MEBs, and give a couple of kind of overview pointers on the topic of today. So no further ado, let me see if I can move to the next slide. Yeah, so today we're looking at when and why and how can we review and update our MEB once we already have an MEB established. Just as a little housekeeping reminder, as you have heard, like we're doing these Q&As based on the questions that are being asked during the webinar. Please use the Q&A function that you will find on your screen to post questions, and you can post them along like whenever you want during the session. We will pause in between and try and answer your questions, but we will probably not get to all of them. So do write them out and we will take them up and produce this Q&A that will come out next week. So don't hold back with your questions and post them along the presentation. I think that's enough of housekeeping, so let's get to it. As we've done in previous webinars, we like to just start by rebasing ourselves with the definition of the MEB. So as they would say, new readers can start here. And for some of you, it's a repetition, so I apologize. The MEB is defined as what a household requires in order to meet basic or essential needs on a regular seasonal basis and its cost. Okay, this sounds familiar to most of us at this point. So just as we've said in previous webinars, of course, this means that to set an MEB, you need to find out what are these essential basic needs that people are in need of. We're talking here about items or goods and services that can be monetized or put a price against, if you will, and that people can access in sufficient quality and quantity through their local markets and services. So it's important to note, and also for the purposes of this webinar, it's going to sort of, I think, transpire a bit. We're talking about things that people are accessing through markets. Okay. And then, of course, and also very much in the spirit of everything that we've talked about here in the last, in the series, an MEB is inherently multi-sectoral. Okay, so old news, but always good to repeat and remind ourselves. So what we wanted to talk about today, let me take you back to what we have been through in this series. We started out with how do we even construct an MEB in the first place? Like what are the kind of tools available to us? What kind of data do we use? What kind of process do we follow? What are the different approaches and how do we kind of come up with this product? Now, and then we've also looked a little bit further into specific applications, like how do we take health into account? How do we take energy needs into account? And also, and very importantly, like how do we use it? How do we operationalize the MEB if we want to set a transfer value based on it? So this is where we're sort of at in our discussions at this point. Now, one thing that has come up during the series, and that's why we wanted to have the final webinar on this topic, is, okay, so when we have this MEB, and maybe we have started using it to set a transfer value or to monitor cost of living against, when is it time to review it, and based on this review, maybe also revise it and actually change the MEB? That's what we wanted to give a little bit of a direction to today. So I think a good place to start when we want to think about this is to go back again to the definition that we were just looking at and think about what is the MEB actually telling us. So we have the definition here again. I'm not going to read it out, but basically the way that at least I like to think about this is that there are two major things that can really change with the MEB. We talk about cost. We talk about how much it costs for households to cover these needs. That's the MEB threshold. So of course, costs can change. Costs usually change over time because market prices change. That's the first thing that we'll talk a little bit about. And then the other thing that can change is that people's actual needs can change. So the composition of what is inside the basket, if you will, if you think of it as a shopping list, that can also change. And whether both of those are changing or only one of them, that also then directs how you want to go about your review and possibly your revision. So we wanted to start with sort of separating those two out. Think about it as price changes and composition changes. So in order to get a little bit into what that then means, see if I can, that were too many slides ahead, sorry. So some good practices then when we talk about these things that can change the MEB. Of course, if we want to understand if cost changes, we need to monitor what things cost in the market. So the first good practice here is to monitor market prices. The cost of whatever goes into your basket, the costs that are facing households that we are servicing, it needs to be tracked regularly. I'm sure that most of you who are listening in who work for operational agencies that are dealing with market-based interventions probably have some way or form of market monitoring established. This is absolutely key. How often, which items you monitor, where you do it, all this depends really on your operation, on what it is that you are really, where you're monitoring, where your intervention is based, where the MEB is sort of valid for, if you will. But of course, in order to be able to check if prices are changing, we need to continue to monitor them. I want to already now make a kind of a point clear here, and that is that just because we monitor the price of the MEB, the cost of the things that are in that MEB, that doesn't necessarily have to mean that we automatically change whatever programmatic decision is based on that MEB. We'll return to this a little bit later. Just to say, just because you're monitoring the cost of that MEB, changing that into a decision in your program, like say changing the transfer value, it might happen, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an automatic chain reaction one to the other. Okay, so that's market monitoring. We'll come back to that a little bit. Then there's another sort of best practice, I would say, when we talk about reviewing and revising the MEB. As much as possible, if needs are not changing, if people's needs are staying the same, we don't want to keep changing the MEB composition. If you recall from the first few webinars, what we really try and emphasize when we talk about composing an MEB is that the MEB reflects needs and household consumption choices. And so unless there's a really strong reason or a good reason, which there could be many, but unless there is a reason to believe that that has changed, it's better to keep your MEB composition intact and just continue to monitor the price of it. If you do that, if you have an MEB that is only changing, if you will, with market prices, you can actually use it as a really solid tool to monitor people's ability to meet their needs over time. Okay. So those are just two kind of key things. Monitor prices, and most of you already do, or your partners do, or you have some sort of an idea of that. And then if you have an MEB that is well established and it still reflects consumption of the people that it intends to describe, then there is not necessarily any need to change the composition of the basket. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about both of those, and then I'll leave it over to the actual practitioners to talk. Okay, so market price monitoring. Just a couple of points on this. So which items do you need to monitor? Again, like it really depends on what's in your MEB and what's relevant consumption items for the people that this MEB has been constructed for. If you have an MEB that is itemized, meaning the MEB has every sort of item that goes in it specified, then and if you have the bandwidth for it, you monitor all of those items and you simply update the price of that MEB once you have updated prices. Alternatively, and sometimes if we don't have, let's say, an itemized MEB, what you can also think about is constructing, let's say, what we would think of as a price index. So you think of what are the key consumption items that people tend to have in different groups of consumption, and you monitor those items. So basically, in a nutshell, you want to stay as close as to what people are consuming in your price monitoring. I also want to make a plug here for, as much as possible, leverage the interagency force that you have, because a lot of agencies are monitoring prices, and sometimes we tend to monitor prices of the same things. Maybe there's scope for collaboration through your CAS working group. Maybe you can actually join forces and save time and save cost by collaborating on the price monitoring. Just a little idea here. So how often do you need to then monitor prices and update the price of your MEB? It depends. It depends on the economic environment that you're operating in. I think what we most often see is that the costs are monitored at least on a monthly basis. That tends to be the case often. But of course, if inflation is not very high, if prices tend to move very slowly, maybe you don't need to update the prices as often. If prices are moving very, very fast, you might need to monitor more often. So it really depends, but monthly is the kind of the frequency that we see most typically. I already said a little bit about price indices, which is really just putting together a weighted index of prices of relevant consumption items. In some countries, though I would guess not that many where we are operating and really using MEBs for humanitarian purposes, but in some contexts, you find national CPIs, or national consumer price indices, and you can use those as a way to monitor inflation and hence the cost of the basket. Okay, so those are just a few kind of points on price monitoring. I want to repeat the point that we said before, that one thing is to sort of monitor what your basket costs. Another thing is to translate that into an operational change. Yeah, I'll come back to that. Okay, that was the price change. Then we have the composition change on the other hand. So when is it time to review that? I've listed here a couple of sort of points that could lead you to want to revisit the composition of what goes into your basket. So we have 4 things here, and there could be others, but I think these are like kind of the main points to consider. Has there been a shock? Has something happened where you are in the population or in the area that your MEB is created for that has disturbed, let's say, the normal order of things? So additional needs or different needs, new needs have been created that needs to be taken into consideration in your MEB. It could also be, and this relates to what we just talked about, that if costs of really key consumption items, items that weigh heavily in people's budgets, have changed, like say you always eat maize, but all of a sudden maize is really, really scarce, hence really, really expensive, and you substitute your consumption and you start eating rice instead, and that is kind of, that's the trend, that's what people are now doing, then that might be something that really influences that overall composition of consumption that makes you want to trigger a review in what is inside the basket. Yeah. So substitution. You can also think about population changes. Has there been a change in the composition of the population that the MEB is constructed for? For instance, has there been a huge influx of IDPs, meaning that in this area where your MEB is relevant, now actually has other people in it that, you know, would also be recipients of whatever program is based on the MEB, but their consumption necessities look different. And lastly, what about the supply side of things? Has the supply side, or maybe the service provision side, changed significantly, meaning that other things are now available to people so that their consumption has changed, or things that were not provided before for free are now provided for free, for instance, in the health sector, meaning that it's no longer a relevant consumption item in a consumption basket, in a minimum expenditure basket. As I tend to do here, I'm not giving you a whole lot of sort of solutions or plug and play things for how to do it. Rather, I like to give you points to think about that can trigger a necessary thought process when you are dealing with your MEB. So that is also the point here. These are all things to kind of have as a mental checklist. Are these things relevant? Are these things happening? Should we think about changing our minimum expenditure basket? So that's actually all I really want to say. I just want to leave you with this. So monitoring the cost of the MEB is different from changing or updating the composition of the MEB. And again, this is also different from then changing the transfer value based on that MEB. We should always monitor the cost of the MEB so that we know if the cost of living is changing for the people that we are serving. At some point, depending on those factors we just talked about, you might want to revisit the composition of what goes into that basket. And then again, translating all of this into operational decision-making, which is how much do we then give to people, is again a third thing. If you want to talk more about transfer values, I really encourage you to revisit the webinar we had last week with the recording and the Q&A that's coming out, because it talks a whole lot about all these other things outside of just the MEB and the cost of that MEB that goes into the transfer value decision. So that's why we wanted to make sure that so it is sort of clear that these things are different. They relate, but they are kind of different processes and different decisions. Okay, so I think that's enough from my side. I will now give the floor to Ji to take us through the case of a revision of the Mali MEB. Over to you, Ji.
Okay, thank you very much, Nuna, and good afternoon, everybody. So I think that we'll go through the key trigger of the MEB review and update in the context of COVID-19 in Mali. So please, could you go to the next slide? Okay, thank you. So I will go straight to the point so that we can have time to exchange, because it's a conversation. So for the case of Mali, what we saw with the COVID-19 was the shock Nuna was talking about a few minutes ago. We get the COVID-19, and what we saw in terms of impact was first an abnormal price increase, plus 5 to 10%. Regarding, for instance, the cereal and the pulse. And usually it's abnormal for this period because it's usually price we are, this pricing price we are seeing during the lean season in June. So there was already this abnormal price increase. Also what we saw was the change in terms of the expenditure structure. So the change in terms of household need and priority, because there was loss of income. The loss of income was evaluated to 20 to 25% in terms of reduction. And so also there was, due to this reduction of income, there was a significant bulk of household, 20%, who was not anymore able to meet the essential needs. Mainly in terms of food, in terms of health, in terms of transport. Recall that there was a movement restriction that led to all this. And if you recall also in Mali, especially in the north of Mali, they are neighboring with Algeria, and most of the food is coming from Algeria. So with the closing border closing, so there was a disruption in terms of food and commodity supply for the north of the country, leading to increase of the prices. So taking into account this reduction of income, taking into account this increase of the price, and also taking into account the fact that the household need to adjust to a kind of to compensate, we saw also an increase in terms of the gaps, food and non-food gap. So I will speak about, I will come back to that in the next slide. And what we was, the evidence we was using we used the NSAN, it's the National Food Security Survey, done 2 times per year in September and also in February. Also, there was FAO, WFP, NGOs, Food Security Cluster, they set up, and the Cash Working Group, they set up a joint coordinated monitoring system to have a look to the COVID impact. It was a part of this system was including mobile phone service, market and traders and key informant service also. Beside that, also, there was several prospective analysis done by WFP, by the World Bank, by the government, to try to understand the potential impact, because we call that there was a kind of difficulty to now do face-to-face assessment. So also we need to rely on key scenario, the probable scenario, the most probable scenario, and see what will happen. And also, for instance, for the government, it was anticipating 5% of increase, while with the monitoring of price from the WFP, from the government also, we saw that this price commodity increase was more or less close to 10%. WFP also conducted 2 market assessment so that they can update the figures beside the normal monitoring that was including market access, market functionalities, availability of food, and the supply. So could you move to the next slide, please? So, okay. So in terms of the results, that led to an increase of the MEB at national level by 5%. So the previous amount was close to $39 and we move up to $41. Also, in terms of the increase of food and non-food gap, this was a significant increase because, like as I said before, there was a loss of income, a significant loss of income. So the gap raised from 36% of the MEB value to 53%. And just to raise the issue that this gap was evaluated at subnational level, region, and also cycle with the admin 2 level, and also for specific vulnerable group, because we need also to ensure that there is an impact of the analysis or the revision of the MEB in the programming aspect. So like we focus on IDP and several other vulnerable groups. So in terms of the impact, once again, Nuna, if you can just come back for the impact in terms of programming. The impact was mainly an increase of the caseload and the coverage, because it was also now, you know, that COVID was eating more significantly the urban settlement, and also people affected by COVID, in addition to already the rural bulk we was having for the humanitarian assistance. Also, the increase in terms of the assistance duration from 9 months, from 6 months to 9 months, and also an increase of the transfer value. But I think that I will stop there and let people discuss and ask questions if needed. Thank you very much, Nuna. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you very much, Guy, for this very excellent presentation. I think it's a great illustration of how price monitoring is critical for MEB update. And it's also related to last week's webinar, a very interesting examples of what kind of programmatic decisions can be made out of the MEB construction and update. So thank you very much for this experience sharing. I'll ask all participants to please use the Q&A function to ask questions, so it's much easier for us to track your questions instead of the chat. We had a good example of an update of the MEB composition in the chat from Iran. And before coming to this, I would like to open the floor to Alexandre to share the example from Lebanon. Over to you, Alex.
Great. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Natalie. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes? Great. Okay, so my name is Alex. I work with the ICRC. I'm based at the headquarters in Geneva, and I work with the Economic Security Department. I'm the Global cash and markets advisor. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to discuss MEB and transfer value after the explosion, the massive explosion that happened in early August at the port, the main port in Beirut. So here on the title slide, you can see a picture of the devastation. So this is one of the large warehouses that was at the port, and around the port, you can see the total destruction, right? So I'll try to keep this presentation short so that I leave room for the discussion, for the conversation later on. And one of my colleagues in Beirut is also on the call. So hopefully if I say something that isn't correct, she'll be able to provide clarification. So what I found interesting in the example in Beirut is that we are in a context of a protracted crisis. Lots of Syrian refugees have been living in Lebanon for the past few years. And in addition to this protracted crisis, we had a massive shock. So it's like an acute crisis within a protracted crisis, right? There has been a lot of work. We can move to the next slide, please, Nuna. The Lebanese context is quite interesting because there has been a lot of work around the minimum expenditure basket, but also the survival minimum expenditure basket. I'll talk more about the MEB here, but it's important to understand that there were an MEB constructed for the Syrian refugees, and there was also a survival MEB because of funding cuts and different issues. So MEB can be quite politicized, so I won't go into all the details here, but I think it's important to keep in line the construction of the MEB and also the poverty line, right, in a country. So there has been several efforts to review the amounts that were constructed in 2014 and agreed by the Interagency's Basic Assistance Working Group. But despite all the different initiatives, the amounts haven't changed until 2020, actually. So when the blast happened on the 4th of August, there was a review of the SMEB and the MEB that was already underway. And I'm sure some of you have received recently the two reports that were published, one I think in March by WFP, and another one I think a month ago, that is the review of the SMEB for the Syrian refugees, okay? So it's important to understand that there was a protracted crisis affecting Lebanon. On top of this, since the end of 2019, Lebanon has been facing an economic and financial crisis, unprecedented in this magnitude, with potential devastating effects on economic and social vulnerability of households, including Syrian refugees and Lebanese households. So families have been grappling with mounting inflation rates. We talk about hyperinflation in the context of Lebanon. That was before the blast. So a lot of loss of income, rising unemployment. For example, and this is an extract from the recent reports that were published, in 2020, more than 24% of refugees' families have reduced the number of meals consumed per day, while 23% of families have withdrawn children from school since October 2019. So these two evidence show how serious the economic and financial crisis was in Lebanon before the blast. On top of this, you had this massive explosion, right? So on the map here, you see where the blast happened. So this is the port, and you see the different colors. So basically the part in red, it was total destruction. A lot of buildings have been destroyed, a lot of infrastructures. Then you see the part in light orange and in light yellow. These are all the parts where serious or minor damages were reported. And on the right corner on top, you see Beirut and the level, the magnitude of the impact of destruction compared to the whole country. So it gives you a bit of an idea of how serious this blast was. I think we are talking about approximately 4,000 people who lost their lives. And an important figure that was reported in the news is 300,000 people who've been left homeless after the blast. So obviously, assistance for shelter was a major issue. So some of you might be familiar with the context in Lebanon. There are several platforms and working groups, humanitarian working groups. One of them is the Basic Assistance Working Group that was instrumental in constructing the MEB and the SMEB in 2014. After the blast, there were several discussions trying to see how we can come up with an appropriate cash response. There was an agreed MEB. There was an agreed multi-purpose cash transfer value that was approximately $175 for a family, average of 5 people. So humanitarian actors could have used this transfer amount that has been approved but a few years ago. Because of the economic situation, because of hyperinflation, several actors, including ICRC and the Lebanese Red Cross, thought it was needed to revise a bit the MEB and the transfer value, okay? So our teams on the ground, so close collaboration between ICRC and LRC, we did some assessments and we came up with an amount. Next slide, please, Nuna. So this is my last slide, right? It's a bit small, sorry for this. I'm not gonna go through all the details here, but it's just to give you a bit the breakdown of this amount. And we came up with the figure of $300 for a family of 5 people to cover their emergency month for 1 month, okay? And this transfer value of 300 was meant to cover 100% of the revised MEB. So this was some work done internally within the movement, okay? So ICRC hasn't been super involved in all the previous discussion around MEB, but we conducted some studies, and the big worry that we had was to transfer massive amounts of money using the Lebanese pound, so the local currency, in a hyperinflation context. So there was a bit of analysis that was conducted. We went back to the literature to show if there were cases where if there was cash assistance that has been implemented in a hyperinflation context. And we saw examples from Malawi, for example, where a DFID program supported enrollment of girls in school, decided to switch from using the local currency, it was Malawian kwacha, and to transfer directly British pounds to affected to beneficiaries of the program. So that was an example. There were a few other ones. So basically, the movement, the Red Crescent movement, lobbied so that cash transfer for affected households in Beirut were done in US dollars in an attempt to mitigate hyperinflation, but not to fuel hyperinflation, right? So there was a lot of discussion between different actors already operating in Beirut because there were some existing platforms. It facilitated these discussions. Not all the actors were in favor of using US dollars, but in the end, a couple of large actors, so ICRC, the Lebanese Red Cross, WFP, decided to transfer multi-purpose cash using US dollars after the agreement with the government and the central bank. The idea is not to now completely forget the local, the local currency, but for a short period of time, use US dollars. So this first transfer started, I think, a month ago. ICRC and the Lebanese Red Cross are currently doing post-distribution monitoring to see a bit the effect and the impact, but see how the money was used, and to see also how much local currency households could get with the US dollars, because as I'm sure you know, there is the official exchange rate in Lebanon, and there is a parallel one. There are actually 3 different exchange rates. Some of the humanitarian actors have managed to negotiate a preferential exchange rate, meaning that more local currency can be transferred in the hands of affected households. But hyperinflation was a critical issue. And basically, so ICRC has been targeting 1,500 households affected by the conflict, affected by the blast. So typically families who've lost a family member, the breadwinner. And among the 1,500 households, ICRC with the Lebanese Red Cross has conducted follow-up economic vulnerability to identify the most vulnerable households who will be eligible for monthly cash transfer for the next few months. So we will be looking at the PDM to see how effective this assistance was and what changes or corrections might need to happen. A concern might be potential tensions between typically Syrian refugees who've been receiving local currency for the past few years and households who've been receiving for the past months or 2 months US dollars, because it is quite an important gap because of the different exchange rates. So I'll stop now, and I look forward to your questions. And my colleague Meg is also on the call. So in case the questions are too tricky, I'll nicely pass the questions to her. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. I see that we have few questions, so I really encourage you to use the Q&A function, so to ask your question. Guy already addressed one question, but let me read out loud, because I think that it could be very interesting for all to know, and it's also a good reminder of our discussions last week. So the question from Iba Mohammed was, how did you come to the decision of increasing the MEB by 5% compared to the 17% increase in the gap? And so Guy, I'll let you develop a bit your answer. Thank you.
Yes, I think that it's two things. The increase of the MEB, the value of the MEB, as Nona said in his definition, is based on the composition, the item you put inside the MEB, plus the price of this item in the market. That is what gives you the value, to make it simple, the value of the MEB. Then, which means that if, for instance, we have an increase of the price by 5%, then more of all the goods, we can assume that we will have the increase of the MEB by also 5%. So that is different from the gap. Now, for the case of the Mali, the increase was based on the increase of the commodity, the item price, and also the change in the structure. Now, regarding the gap, we know that this is maybe the cost, the MEB is the cost to access to essential need. The household, through income, activity, and all the things, have its own capacity to meet a portion of this MEB. Then the remaining part is the gap. So if, for instance, before the crisis, the gap was, let's say, 36%, now there is an increase of the MEB value, but in the meantime, you have a decrease of the income. So which means that the household will not anymore having the capacity to meet the essential need, and this capacity will be reduced. So it's why we have this increase from 36% to 53%, the 70% of the gap you are saying. So you see that there is a difference between the 5% of increase of the MEB due to price increase and change on the structure, and also the gap who is increasing due to also at the same time the decrease of the income, so the decrease of the capacity of the household to meet their capacity. Now is why I just like to touch a little the impact in terms of the transfer value, because it's why then what will happen is that if the gap is increasing because they lost their income, you need to increase the transfer value so that you help the household to meet the minimum, who is the MEB. I hope that that is clear. Over to you.
Thank you, Guy. I think it's crystal clear, and I suggest we take this answer as a short video to remind everyone the difference between the MEB and the transfer value. There will probably be some follow-up products to that webinar service, so we'll keep you posted. There was a very quick question for your presentation, Alex, which I think is more clarification question. What was the household size for the MEB in Lebanon?
Yes, good question. I'm not sure I mentioned that, but it was an average of 5 people. Okay, so when it was initially constructed in 2014, it was an average of 5 people. So the MEB was $114 per person. So the total MEB was 570 households. That's quite high. And for the SMEB, it was $87 per person. And for the whole household, so you multiply this by 5, that was 475, okay? But the multi-purpose, so the transfer value wasn't the full amount. Basically, there was some amount reducted, basically the income that some of the refugees could make, and then the amount, the equivalent of the food assistance. So the multi-purpose cash received by Syrian refugees was $175, but this amount was converted into local currency, okay? And the difference after the blast was that it was $300, not converted into local currency, but directly distributed in US dollars to affected households in Beirut, including Lebanese households and Syrian refugees. I hope that's clearer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Nuna, I'll turn to you for 2 questions we have. So one is on inflation and volatility of prices. Would you recommend to index the MEB to the general yearly inflation to preserve purchasing power of beneficiaries in case there is no high volatility of prices? And we also have a question on for countries that are very diverse feeding and living habits like Ethiopia. Should we, like, how would you prepare the country level MEB in such cases? And if the MEB significantly increased, what is the donor approval or like view in changing the transfer value? And do we have any experience of it? So okay. I'm sure you have.
This is great because it actually together touches on the 3 points that we were making before. One is on prices, and one is on composition, and the last one is on transfer values. And that's great. So we get to touch on all of that. So in terms of inflation, the starting point is always monitor the cost of your MEB. So whether you have a high inflation or a low inflation, deflation environment, always monitor the cost of the MEB. And so how you go about that is then the question, right? I mean, if, you know, in a lot, like the sort of, for me at least, to think of like the simplest case is that you think of your MEB as this kind of shopping list with items on it, and you go out once per month, once per 3 months, however often you need to, and you basically check what does that cost in the market. And that is basically an inflation monitoring, because at the end of the day, if you think about it, how do government monitor inflation? It's by a consumer basket, usually a lot more complex than what we have in our quite simple MEBs, but it's the same thinking, right? You have a consumption bundle and you measure how that changes over time. So in a way, you can think of monitoring the price of an MEB as kind of a simple version of a consumer price index. It's all related, if you will. What is different is that our composition of our baskets is usually adapted to the people that we've constructed the MEB specifically for, and it's usually also specifically focusing on certain areas that we are specifically interested in, whereas the CPI for a country monitored by the National Bureau of Statistics is kind of a nationwide measure. Usually it focuses on urban centers. It may not be 100% linking with the MEB that we have. But the basic idea is the same. Consumption bundle, monitor prices, find out how that kind of changes over time. So to answer the question, like if you have low inflation, can you just use like a yearly inflation measure? Yeah, if you have nothing else to give you a sense of how your MEB is developing over time, sure, I would always keep an eye on what the official government inflation index tells you. But I would also really be mindful of whether that inflation index is appropriate to the context, the specific place where I've constructed the MEB. And I would say that especially if you're using the MEB to actually set operational decisions, to actually do a transfer value, I would always recommend that you do a more sort of ground level inflation or price monitoring. But I think just to sort of dispel the mystery, these things are not existing on different planes. Like when we monitor prices and we put those prices on items in a basket, we are actually monitoring inflation. It may not just be following the same exact methodology as the inflation index in a certain country, but it's our version of it, if you will. So always do it. Do it maybe on a monthly frequency. Maybe if you really don't have a whole lot of price movement and you don't have any compelling reason to change your operations very frequently, maybe monitoring it twice per year is enough, but that really is depending on the context that you're in. So that was the inflation question. Then there was a question of like, how do we set a national MEB in a place like Ethiopia, let's say, that's a super diverse country with very different kinds of cultures and eating habits across. I would say you don't necessarily have to. It depends on, and that would, again, I would encourage you to go back and revisit the very first webinar, like if the MEB should reflect consumption, right? And so sometimes you would have a reason for why you would want to have just one national measure, but especially if you want to really translate this into transfer values that are specific to specific places in the country, why not do different MEB compositions depending on where you are? You can also, sometimes we see baskets that are, let's say there's a basic basket that's the same, but then there's certain variations like housing costs, because that differs a lot between places. So you have a basic food basket maybe that stays the same if food consumption is quite homogeneous, but other costs differ. It's really done in many different ways across different contexts, but there's nothing to say that you have to have a national MEB for the purposes of what we're really talking about here, which is mainly humanitarian intervention. It's not a rule. Okay, and then the last question, what about the transfer value? So again, like just because the cost of living goes up, just because your MEB goes up, the price of that MEB, it doesn't necessarily mean that, again, that there's a rule that then your transfer value should change. Of course, if cost of living goes up and you're giving people cash to pay for their needs, the value of that cash becomes smaller. So if you want to preserve their purchasing power, you should think about revising the transfer value. Ji also made a really, really good point that, of course, it's not just about the cost also going up. It could also be that people's own ability to pay goes down at the same time. So the gap becomes proportionally even larger. You need to keep an eye on this. The best thing to sort of, in terms of how do you then take that to your donor, I would say that the proof is in the pudding. Like you need to have that data available. You need to be able to sort of show that. And I think our ECHO colleague who were here in the last webinar also said that very nicely. Show the analysis. Like this is what you can do. You can show that costs are going up, if that's the case. You can show that people's ability to pay for those costs is going down, if that's the case. And so if you stick with a transfer value that is not changed, you are effectively eroding people's purchasing power. But that is, let's say, on you as analysts, as program people, to show and advocate. Now I've already said a lot. I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Nina. I would just add one point, like on the donor side. I think that the added value and ECHO put it quite clearly last year is the added value of the MEB is to provide this kind of evidence and like joint analysis. So if your MEB is well done and if your monitoring and update is done and consensual, like if there is alignment across partners on the findings around the MEB, it would be much more easier to advocate to your donors for an updated transfer value if relevant and if need be. There is a question that Guy, maybe you'd like to address. That is actually a very recurring question. I think we had that one in each of our webinars. Do we consider older aged people needs and nutrition, especially working in areas where malnutrition rates are higher? So broadly speaking, like what about including the specific needs in the MEB construction or update? Guy, and I hand over to you on this one.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathalie. We faced this situation in Mali, where there was a discussion with the nutrition cluster to see if we can incorporate malnutrition and all these items raised by Shaka. So what we end is first, the MEB was designed for the, let's say, the average household. So that, and we assume that in the average household, we have more or less the normal pattern of the household, which can include like older people, pregnant and lactating women, so that more or less their needs are reflected. We discussed also with donors, because donors also chip in, because there was, they chip in and they say, as they usually there's malnutrition program are formed and the household doesn't need to pay some money for that, even if it's an essential need, but it's already covered, there is a kind of subsidies of that, so we cannot include that in the calculation of the MEB. So it's like the education, if the education fees is taken in charge by the government, we cannot incorporate that in the calculation of the MEB. So at the end, we say that yes, they are important for the household, but it's already taken into account through some humanitarian assistance program. So there is no need to ensure that we take that into account. So it will depend on the context. I think that it will depend on the context. It will depend on the discussion and also the agreement in the country to see in which extent some element of malnutrition or maybe education, health also can chip in for that. What need to be monetized in the case of the MEB? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Guy. We have just 3 minutes left. So I ask maybe Nuna, if you have examples, it's Jacqueline who asked the question. Any example where monitoring data shows the MEB value decreases, especially after a shock when prices may stabilize again? And maybe you or Guy and Alex may want to share any rule that you'd have within your organization about when change of gap of MEB and income should lead to change of transfer value, because we know that people want direction. And as throughout the webinar series, we said to you that we don't have solutions to every question, because it's very context specific and based on analysis. But Nuna, over to you for whatever you could share on this.
Yeah. Have I ever seen a context where the cost of the MEB has gone down? Yes, I have, absolutely, as a result of regular price monitoring. Again, I think it's important that we then make the distinguish between, does that mean then that automatically transfer values went down? Not necessarily, right? And I think it's really important that when we see these changes in prices, that we don't just like automatically every month pull the trigger on transfer values, especially if we do this without explaining to households what's going on. So this is one of the pet peeves I've been trying to sort of put through here. Like, one thing is what your monitoring shows you, the other thing is how that translates into program. But yes, for sure, just like prices go up, sometimes they also go down, and sometimes it's just natural seasonal variation. And that is just in the countries we operate, where people depend on agriculture and production that is local. That's just how it is. So how you want to then deal with that operationally is another question. Then I'll be very quick in terms of, do we have any rules for how, like, when you trigger a change? I, in WFP at least, know the sort of hard and fast rule from, like, sometimes country offices set their own parameters based on the local context. What I would see is usually it's somewhere in between 10 and 20% is what leads you to think that now the price change is so severe that you need to think about changing your transfer value. I'm going to stop here and see. I think, Alex, you were indicating before you wanted to make a comment.
Yes, thanks a lot. There was a question from Simon Rank. I mentioned hyperinflation. So he's pointing out that technically speaking, it's not hyperinflation, and he's correct. So in the case of Lebanon, we haven't reached the threshold, you know, to be technically speaking talking about hyperinflation. So I should have mentioned very steep inflation. Nonetheless, it's very serious inflation that demands that humanitarian actors look at it seriously, and this is pretty much what we try to do. And there was another question from Simon related to the food commodities included to calculate the basket. So the food commodities are pretty much the same used by WFP. I think there was also a revision by WFP, and they came up with an amount of 250 USD, and this amount was also distributed in USD, if I'm not mistaken. A difference between the amount calculated and distributed by WFP and ours, so the movement, not only ICRC but the Lebanese Red Cross, is that the 300 USD included a higher amount for medical expenses. A lot of people have been damaged, have been hurt, injured. So there was more for medical bills, medical expenses. And because it's also COVID pandemic, we included the cost for PPE, so personal protective equipment. So this is a bit of a, factors that explain the difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Guy, do you want to take 30 seconds to 1 minute to share what you just typed on the Mali experience of seasonal change and how you featured that in the MEB?
Yes, there was a question of Jacqueline asking if there was a decrease. Yes, in case of the Mali, we observed a decrease from between September and February, a decrease by, I think, $3 to $5 US. So, but that did not lead to the change or the review of the MEB because it was anticipated since the beginning. But what I will say is just like usually the change is motivated, is linked also to the gaps. If the change of the MEB lead also to an increase of the gaps, then you will have a push from all stakeholders to review the MEB value. So this is what I can say for the 30 seconds you allow me to speak. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Guy. And I think that was also a very relevant question because we had recurring question about how do we take into account the seasonal changes. And so we need to bear in mind that it can be in the right direction or not. And so it depends on how you choose to feature it in your MEB. Thank you very much for all who attended not only this webinar, but the whole series. I think we have one or two, or maybe a handful of heroes who've been with us throughout the webinar series. Thank you very much. We really appreciated the level of engagement, the many questions, very, very interesting and challenging questions and reflections throughout the series. So thank you all very much. As we said, we will be updating the existing tools on the MEB developed by CALB and WFP to take into account all the deep reflections and debates and discussions we had in those webinars. And surely more will come, so stay tuned. Thank you very much to Guy and Alexandre for the great presentations today. That was super interesting. And thank you a million to Nuna, Ibrahima, and Pauline, who've been working very hard to set up that series. We've been really, really pleased to make it happen, and we hope you enjoyed as much as we did. Thank you very much all, and have a very nice rest of the day.
Thanks a lot, Nuna. Thanks a lot, Nathalie. Thanks, Guy.
Thanks,
bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks to all the participants. Bye-bye.
Bye.